Good evening. Welcome to the 2015-2016 150th Anniversary Lectures here at St. Jerome's University. And a special welcome to those of you who may be here at St. Jerome's for the first time. We're very happy that you could join us for this special evening. My name is Christina Vanin. I'm the Associate Dean here at St. Jerome's University, and I'm coordinating this year's lecture series. So before we get started, though, this evening, please, if you haven't done so already, could you turn off any devices that you might have with you this evening? Would you please turn them right off? We are videotaping tonight, so we don't want that to interfere. Thank you very much. In his January 2016 message for the World Day of Migrants and Refugees, Pope Francis said, "In our time, migration is growing worldwide. The tragic stories of millions of men and women daily confront the international community as a result of the outbreak of unacceptable humanitarian crises in different parts of the world. At this moment in human history, marked by these great movements of migration, identity is not a secondary issue. Those who migrate are forced to change some of their most distinctive characteristics, and whether they like it or not, even those who welcome them are forced to change. In addition, the arrival of migrants and displaced persons, asylum seekers and refugees gives rise to suspicion and hostility. There's a fear that society will become less secure, that identity and culture will be lost, that competition for jobs will become stiffer, and even that criminal activity will increase. A change of attitude towards migrants and refugees is needed on the part of everyone, moving away from attitudes of defensiveness and fear, indifference and marginalization, all of which are typical of a throwaway culture, and move towards attitudes based on a culture of encounter. From the perspective of a culture of encounter, it's important to view migrants and refugees above all as persons whose dignity is to be protected and who are capable of contributing to the general welfare of our societies. We are very privileged to have Lawrence Hill with us this evening, someone who has been thinking about the plight of refugees since the summer of 1973, when he worked at Pearson Airport in the Ontario Welcome Centre, welcoming and helping newcomers to Canada. Lawrence Hill, as I'm sure you know, is the author of 10 books, including The Illegal and the Book of Negroes. He is the winner of various awards, including the Commonwealth Writers' Prize, the Rogers Writers' Trust Fiction Prize, and CBC Radio Canada Reads, and maybe again this year, we'll see. Mr. Hill delivered the 2013 Massey Lectures based on his nonfiction book, Blood, the Stuff of Life. He co-wrote the adaptation for the 6-part television miniseries, The Book of Negroes, which has attracted millions of viewers in both Canada and the United States. Currently, he is writing a new novel and working on a children's book, and he is co-writing a television miniseries adaptation of The Illegal. He holds honorary doctorates from 5 Canadian universities. In 2015, he was appointed a member of the Order of Canada. He received the Governor-General's History Award for Popular Media, the Pierre Burton Award, and he was inducted into Canada's Walk of Fame. This year, 2016, his novel, The Illegal, was shortlisted for Canada Reads. And his screenplay for the TV miniseries adaptation of the Book of Negroes was shortlisted for a Canadian Screen Award for Best Writing. Mr. Hill volunteers with Crossroads International, the Black Loyalist Heritage Society, and Project Bookmark Canada. And he lives with his family in Hamilton, Ontario, and also in Woodpoint, Newfoundland, Labrador. Please join me in welcoming Lawrence Hill to speak to us on the topic, Identity as Performance. You're given a script, but you can switch it, maybe. Lawrence Hill.
Give me a little fun.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vanine. It's really wonderful to be back at St. Jerome's University. I came here about 7 years ago to talk about the Book of Negroes, and so I'm so glad to be back speaking with you again. And this morning I spoke bright and early to a group of grade 7 and 8 students in Oakville, Ontario, who'd been assigned to read in their class, grade 7, the Book of Negroes, and read and just ate it up and had all sorts of questions for me, and their questions were fantastic and provocative and disturbing. But the last question I was asked this morning was by this child in grade 7 who said, "How old do you expect to be when you write your last book?" Thanks. Thanks a lot, child. And so I just said that I hope to keep writing until I died, and that I didn't plan on retiring, and I couldn't think of a more exciting way to keep living than to keep writing, and that if things went my way, I'd write on the day that I departed this earth. And I don't know how much consolation that is to my mother, who's still so wary about the idea of having a child who's a novelist, an adult child who's a novelist, that she has a permanent quote from the American novelist Philip Roth posted to her refrigerator door. And the quote says, "When a writer is born into a family, that family is finished." Not too happy about this writer-son thing. But I thought that I'd sort of talk a little bit about identity, about the fluidity of identity tonight with you. And I thought that one way to do it would be to give a few shortish readings from a few different books of mine, including a bit from the illegal, and just chat a little bit about identity and its fluidity. And I can think of all sorts of ways to begin this conversation, but maybe I'll share one kind of funny anecdote, but I think really gets to the heart of just how much identity is up for grabs and depends on a litany of circumstances which are ever shifting. Because I'm of kind of mixed race, black and white identity, generally identify if somebody's prodding me as black, but don't wake up in the mirror and look at myself and conclude that every time I brush my teeth. It generally is something that's kind of required by interactions with the world. At any rate, when I left high school and went off to study at UBC in the mid-1970s in Vancouver, if anybody was teasing out or remarking on my identity, they'd be talking about how I was black or mixed race and asking about that. And that would be the focal point of their interrogation of or their meditations about my identity. That's what people would pounce on, say, in Vancouver in the mid-1970s. Fine, I was kind of used to that. It happened throughout my childhood growing up in Toronto. And then after a couple of years at UBC, I switched to commence studies and to finish my degree at Université Laval in Quebec City, where I studied economics. And it was a great way to master French because I was the only Anglo in the program, and I went from being black or mixed race in Vancouver to being un maudit anglais in Quebec City. And these are the years building up to the first referendum in Quebec in 1980, and my identity went from being black in BC to being un anglais in Quebec City. It's fascinating, really, how quickly just a plane ride can change the way people remark upon you, the thing that's important to them, the thing that they focus on, and the thing that you become in their eyes, and perhaps partly in your own eyes too, because if everybody else starts seeing you as an Anglais, and who in Vancouver is going to think of themselves as an Anglais? There's no point in that. But suddenly when you're in Quebec City, it means something. And so perhaps my own identity started to shift, and I started to think of myself for the first time, among other things, as being English in Quebec City. So quite an interesting transformation. All it takes is a bus ride or a plane ride, and your identity can switch. And I'm quite interested in that. Rachel Dolezal. Some of you probably remember this story that was big news for a week or so last year in all the newspapers of the world. Who is Rachel Dolezal? Rachel Dolezal is a civil rights activist, a woman, and up until last year, for a year or so, she was the president of the NAACP chapter in Spokane, Washington. She resigned after the allegations were true, that she had lied about her racial identity and that she was white but had told the world that she was black, and she took on this role as president of the NAACP chapter in Spokane, Washington, having lied about her identity. As it turns out, you don't have to be black to lead an NAACP chapter. You could be white and lead it. There's actually no problem doing that. But she did say to the world that she was black. And bizarrely, and I can't imagine what parent would do this to their child, who outed her? How did she get outed as a white woman passing for black? She was outed by her own parents, who went public and said, we're white, we're her biological parents, we're tired of her telling the world that she's black, here it is. So they went to the media and they outed their own daughter, which caused just this huge kerfuffle. The thing that I find most fascinating in this entire debate, regardless of your opinion, and believe me, I've heard divided opinions. When I was, last year I went to talk a few times in New York City about the miniseries adaptation of the Book of Negroes, and I have all my American family, African-American families, mostly lodged in Brooklyn, and I have 6 cousins there, 4 men and 4 women and 2 men who are sort of my age or older, and we had this huge row over dinner. Well, I started it really by asking their opinions about Rachel Dolezal, and it was just for the rest of the night they fought about whether this was a bad thing or what, that she had been white and had passed for black. So the thing that I find most interesting in her case isn't that she was white and passed for black for a while, is how angry people got about this and how divided public opinion was and how invested people were in judging her. All sorts of people have changed their identities, sometimes successfully, other times been outed, but they don't usually get the public approbation that Rachel Dolezal got. Why did people resent her so profoundly? Why was she attacked so viscerally? A man did the very same thing and nobody attacked him whatsoever. His name happens to be John Howard Griffin. Anybody heard of him? John Howard Griffin wrote a book that I read as a 15-year-old that my mother warned me not to read because she thought it would be so upsetting for me that I wouldn't be able to handle it as a teenager. It had made her vomit. It was a book that was so disturbing. His book was called Black Like Me, published for the first time in 1961. Who was John Howard Griffin? He was a white journalist from Texas who undergoes a series of medical interventions, pills and radiation treatments, and transforms his skin into being basically brown or brownish so that he'd be interpreted as being black. So he underwent these treatments, which were very damaging to him. He later died of cancer. But he comes out looking black for a while, or black enough to be taken as black. And then he goes on a series of bus rides, Greyhound bus rides through the southern states for a couple of months to experience what it means to be black. And of course, in 2015, this could be seen as somewhat offensive. I'm going to read to you the little line on the first edition, on the cover of the first edition of John Howard Griffin's book, Black Like Me. These are the words to sell the book on the cover of his first edition. A white man learns what it's like to live the life of a Negro by becoming one. Now, is that possible? Did John Howard Griffin become a Negro? Well, in certain ways, he most certainly did, because if you're traveling on a bus and you're taken as a Negro in 1961 in the Deep South, you can believe that you're going to be sitting in certain areas, you're going to be treated in certain ways. So in certain respects, of course, he became, if you wish, a Negro for a short time in the way the public perceived him. Of course, he went back to being white later when these radiation treatments and pills wore off, but did that make him black? What if he'd transformed his skin and never went back? Then would he have become black? There are so many interesting questions about blackness and whiteness and transition. There's another really interesting example in a fabulous, fabulous, beautifully written book by James McBride. It's called The Color of Water. And The Color of Water is by this American writer. He's written essays and a novel recently, and he's also a well-regarded saxophonist who grew up black in the projects. I think he was in Brooklyn. Now I can't remember what city he was in. It doesn't really matter. He was in the northern states. I think it was Brooklyn. He grows up black, He has no father. He has a bunch of siblings from different fathers, but they all have the same mother, his mother. And he's always assumed that his mother was black. She was a light-skinned black woman, and she was assumed by everybody in the projects to be black because the only people living in the projects were black. And it turns out that when he becomes an adult, he discovers that his mother was actually white. She was raised as an Orthodox Jew. And when she got involved with a black man who became James McBride's father, she was sort of disowned from and left her roots as an Orthodox Jew. And although she didn't have a man in her life anymore, she moved into the projects, raised her kids, and passed for black. And he didn't discover that his mother was actually white until middle age, when he begins the process of investigating his own story. There's another really interesting example. I'll just give one more because I want to really emphasize the fluidity of these things and the relativity of identity. There's a well-known Canadian writer who's a friend of mine, whose name is Wayne Grady, and he's published a book. He's written many nonfiction books, but he published a novel in the last couple of years called Emancipation Day, which is about racial passing. It's set partly in Newfoundland and partly in southwestern Ontario. And Wayne, I don't know his exact age, but he's probably in his 60s. And Wayne discovered in his 40s that his father was black and had passed for white. And he hadn't known this, he hadn't had any trace of it, he had no idea that his father was black and had passed for white, and he felt royally ripped off. I mean, all the family culture, all the people he never met, all the people in his family he was never introduced to, he was never given these opportunities as a child, a teenager, or a young adult. He discovers in his 40s that his father was black. Well, what does that make Wayne exactly? He lived his whole life as white, and suddenly, what is he? Well, again, he began to interrogate this, and I guess what he is or what he became would depend on how he reacted to those circumstances. It's not a pat answer. But identity is so fluid, and it's so ever-changing. I've given the example of what happened when I flew from Vancouver to Quebec City. One other example involves a young woman I interviewed in the late 1990s when I was writing a book called Blackberry Sweet Juice on Being Black and White in Canada. And this was a young woman named Cindy Henwood who had immigrated with her parents from Swaziland to rural Saskatchewan when she was a very young girl. And in Swaziland, many of the rules of racial identity that you found in South Africa were imposed in Swaziland as well. And her family considered itself to be colored in the racial hierarchy of Swaziland in the 1970s and 80s. They were definitely not white, but they were one step above being black. They were colored in this insane and racist racial hierarchy that was employed, of course, in South Africa as well as in Swaziland in some respects. So Cindy thought that she was colored. Her parents certainly identified as colored. If you told them in Swaziland that they were black, well, I'm sure they would have taken great offense at that denomination, at that name. And yet they come to Dundurn, Saskatchewan, and on the first day that Cindy is in this village in Saskatchewan, she's sent by her mother to pick up some milk at the store, and a boy calls her a nigger in the store on her first day in Canada. And she can't be colored anymore. She has no option in terms of embracing and moving into a sense of positivity as a young woman who's going to be seen by everybody around her as black. The only option that was viable for her, she told me as I was researching this book, Blackberry Sweet Juice on Being Black and White in Canada, the only option for her was to embrace a sense of black identity, something she never would have been able to do or would have considered doing in Swaziland in say, the 1970s. It would have been inconceivable. But it was impossible to carry that over the Atlantic and be colored in Saskatchewan. And so she became black, and she embraced it in order to find her way into a sense of pride and a sense of feeling good about herself. So again, one more example of the fluidity and the relativity of race, and really pointing to many of the absurdities of attempting to define people racially. And I got back to this with the children this morning in Oakville. It's a construction that's of our own making, and it's generally one that fails. And when we try to define people racially, we're generally embracing social hierarchies that were imposed by other people long ago, and we're always unhappy with results. We're always unhappy with how racial identity shows up in language, because it never does the job. We're always searching for something better. It's fluid and it's never satisfactory. So just a few thoughts there about the relativity of identity. But nobody hammered John Howard Griffin when he chose to be black for the purposes of making himself into one of the most famous essayists of his day in the United States. So why did everybody hammer Rachel Dolezal with such ferocity? Well, I think some of it has to do with the fact that she was a woman. I think that accentuated the likelihood that she'd be attacked for what she did, whereas what Griffin did was good journalism. What she did was somehow fraudulent. And I can't sort of escape, I can't get away from the sort of the different ways that this same thing is interpreted. But I'll leave you with that, and you could perhaps come to your own conclusions. I have kind of meditated lifelong about notions of identity and belonging and what constitutes identity. I guess that's this, if there is a central theme, and if any of you are complaining, is you going to start writing about something else? At least I suppose you can find that this theme of identity and home and belonging runs through all of my books. And so I thought I'd sort of playfully share and set up a few of the times in which I've reflected on this in my fiction. And the first one comes from, it's not the first time I did it, but the first one I'll share with you tonight comes from a novel called Any Known Blood, in which we follow a family of black people who, over 5 generations, moving back and forth between Baltimore, Maryland, and Oakville, Ontario. And I'll just read you a couple of segments from this book to get right to the heart of identity and its fluidity. This little bit is narrated by Langston Kane V, who tells his family story, the story of his family moving over 5 generations between Canada and the States. I have the rare distinction, a distinction that weighs like a wet life jacket, but I sometimes float to great advantage, of not appearing to belong to any particular race, but of seeming like a contender for many. In Spain, people have wondered if I was French. In France, hotel managers asked if I was Moroccan. In Canada, I've been asked always tentatively if I was perhaps Peruvian, American, or Jamaican. But I've rarely given a truthful rendering of my origins. Once, someone asked, "Are you from Madagascar?" "I know a man from Madagascar who looks just like you." I said, "As a matter of fact, I am. I was born in the capital, Antananarivo. We moved to Canada when I was a teenager." Another time, when a man sitting next to me in a donut shop complained about Sikh refugees arriving in Gander, Newfoundland, I said, "I was born in Canada and I don't wear a turban, but I am a Sikh. My mother's white, but my father's a Sikh, and that makes me one too." The man's mouth fell open. I paid the waitress to bring him 12 chocolate donuts. "I've got to go," I told him, "but next time you want to run down Sikhs, just remember that one of them once bought you a box of donuts." I tried it again at the next opportunity. A woman at a party said Moroccans were sexist pigs, so I became a Moroccan. Then I started claiming I was part Jewish, part Cree, part Zulu, part anything people were running down. My game of multiple racial identities continued until 18 months ago, when my wife left me. It was the lowest point of my life, so low that I didn't much see the point in living, even lower than when my son died in the womb. Shortly before Ellen moved out, I saw an advertisement for a speechwriter for the Ontario Ministry of Wellness. A line ran across the bottom of the advertisement, quote, "As part of an active effort to promote employment equity in the public service, this position has been designated Category 3. Only racial minorities need apply." End quote. I filled out an application. I could have told them the truth, that I was black, or at least partly so, having a white mother and black father. I wanted the job, but I also wanted to test my theory that nobody would challenge my claim to any racial identity. So, in the letter that accompanied a resume and some writing samples, I explained that I was of Algerian origin. I got an interview. They asked if I was actively involved in the Algerian community. I said the Algerian community was rather small in Toronto, but that I did spend time with my brothers and sisters and with family friends. They gave me the job. I still have it. They still think I'm Algerian. I've had to explain that my father changed his name when he came to Canada, and that his original name was Alassane Mahmoudi. I've even had to deny any relation to my father, who's well known in the city and most definitely not Algerian. So after that introductory section of the novel, Langston Kane is fired from his job as a speechwriter, and he moves to Baltimore to sort of begin the process of uncovering his family history, which becomes the stuff of the novel. He digs into 5 generations of family history, which becomes the story. And this is how he finds himself and climbs up from the abyss that he's in when the novel starts. And so he moves to Baltimore. He wants to find the source of his family history by meeting his Aunt Millicent. This is his father's sister. He's never met his Aunt Mill. She was so infuriated when his father married a white woman that she cut him off and has never met his children. He goes to her door in West Baltimore. She won't let him in. She wants nothing to do with him. She slams the door in his face. So he decides one day to track her down in church in West Baltimore. So this is Langston Kane pursuing his aunt on the way to church in West Baltimore, on the way to the African Methodist Episcopal Church in Baltimore, where my great-grandfather was a minister. Here we are. Once more, identity for you tonight. I fell in behind 2 elderly women on the sidewalk. The taller one had the build of a linebacker. She wore high heels, pantyhose, and a white hat with 1 yellow feather pointing skyward, as if to say, "You mess with me, and you'll have to mess with him." The other woman was 6 inches shorter and as wiry as a turkey. She jolted forward with robotic staccato steps. For an instant, I wondered if she was performing a pantomime. Her hat was the color of orange sherbet. It sat on a bald head. I knew this because I saw her take off her hat and whack her companion's sleeve. "I got him," said the short, bald one. "What you hitting me for, girl?" "I got him, Maggie. A hornet was fixing to sting you." "Ain't no hornets on this street. Ain't no people neither." "We're here, Maggie. We've got a congregation of 1,000 people." "We don't live on Druid Hill Avenue. We're like aliens. We land for an hour and then we take off." "You run that mouth of yours nearly as much as my husband does." "I love you to pieces, Eleanor, but don't you mention me in the same breath as that no-account, dim-witted numbskull." Eleanor laughed, shaking her arms out. "You know what that man did last night? He called out for me to bring him a beer." "Hasn't he been doing that for 43 years? Eleanor said, "Yes, but he was sitting in the bath. Here I was making lunch for after church today, and he calls out for a beer in the bath. I'd have poured that beer on his head. You ought to quit giving that man money for drink. Only thing he's good for is eating and drinking. You ought to divorce him." "People don't get divorced at 78 years of age," Eleanor said. "It's too late." "Then you ought to kill him." "He's barely living now, and I can't kill him. He ain't valuable enough to kill. I'll leave that business to the Lord. It's too late for me, Maggie. I'm stuck with that man to the grave. Ugh. Anybody ever put me to rest beside my no-good ex-husband? I swear to God, the 6 o'clock news will be talking about a second resurrection. I'd climb out of my grave faster than Jesus. I wouldn't even spend the night." Eleanor, the short, bald one, slapped her hands together and bent over in laughter. "You ought to watch your mouth, Maggie. That's not Sunday language." Maggie stopped to adjust her purse. I walked up beside them on the sidewalk and caught Eleanor looking at me. "Good morning," I said. "Praise the Lord," Eleanor said. "Is that the AME church?" I asked. "It sure is," Eleanor said. "You visiting?" "I am." "Where are you from?" This came from Maggie, who snapped her purse shut. "Canada." "Canada? My, that's a long way off. You have relations here?" "Just an aunt. I think she's a member of the congregation." "What's her name?" Maggie asked. "Millicent Kane. You know her?" "Millie Kane?" Sure we know Millie. You're Millie Kane's nephew? Maggie edged her glasses down her nose. Good God Almighty, you don't look like any relation of Millie Kane. You're pushing white, son. Pushing awful hard. Leave him be, Maggie, Eleanor said. Most folks that light would just go ahead and pass. They wouldn't come on back to church. Leave him be, I say. Welcome, son. Welcome to Baltimore. Is Millie expecting you? No, but I'm sure I'll bump into her. I wouldn't count on that, Maggie said. We've got a congregation coming out on Sunday mornings of 1,000 people. But we'll find her for you. Help me up these steps, son. Days like this, I get the feeling my bones are made of potato chips. I extended my right arm and Maggie took hold of it. Eleanor took my left arm, clawing it like a bird. We ascended 8 steps into the church foyer. Eleanor gave me a long, approving look and said, I bet you was sweetness indeed when you was born. You hardly weigh a thing. Slim shoulders, practically no backside, little head. I bet you was easy as pie to bring into this world. Your mama was lucky. My first son weighed 11 pounds, 2 ounces, and he came so close to killing me that I nearly killed him. You know what he weighs now? I looked at him with eyebrows raised. Would you believe 333 pounds? Sits in a kitchen chair. He breaks it. Has to take a bus. He needs 2 seats. He's the size of 2 grown men, and they still call him Junior. Here comes your aunt, boy. Here comes Millie. I'll leave that there. But I had fun with that. And I don't know. It's hard to sort of summarize where I come from and what my own traditions are, but I certainly write in the vein of the African-American writers that I ate up as a teenager. And one of the common threads that I discovered in that literature and in Jewish and Russian literatures are an ability to navigate extraordinarily painful things with a light and sometimes funny touch. It can be dangerous and explosive, but I always liked writing about painful subjects lightly. And it can get you into a lot of trouble, but it's also a wonderful way to sort of move into the human heart. So I'm going to move now to another meditation on identity, and this is in just a page or two from the voice of Aminata in the Book of Negroes. And I have, of course, a theory that as far as identity goes, if you're talking about immigration, the immigrant himself or herself is never going to be too worried about their identity. They know exactly who they are and where they came from. It's their children who are going to be messed up and who are going to be wondering, what am I and where do I belong? It generally falls to the children of the first generation immigrants who really might end up struggling with senses of what their identity is, where they belong, how they see themselves. And of course, they get into fights about this with their parents sometimes. But Aminata, despite the fact that she knows perfectly well that she was born in Africa, ripped from Africa as a pubescent girl in 1755 or so, brought over to slavery in the Americas, and then embarked on a long, lifelong effort to try to return to Africa. When she finally gets back to Sierra Leone as an old woman, as a Black Loyalist, sailing from Halifax, Nova Scotia, as 1,200 other Black Loyalists did in 1792, she's actually treated by Africans in Sierra Leone as a white person posing in black skin. And so she too has had a disrupted identity. She too is an African woman returning to Africa after a long life, part of which was spent in slavery in the Americas. And what does she get when she gets back? Well, she's no longer legitimately an African. So her identity too is up for grabs, not so much when she's enslaved in the United States or in danger of being re-enslaved in Canada, but when she goes back to Africa near the end of her life. At any rate, she opens a story that becomes her life, that becomes a slave narrative, a fictional slave narrative, that becomes this novel in London, England, when she's an old woman just a step from the grave. And she's gone to fight for the abolition of the British slave trade. And she's telling her story, which becomes this book. And so here she is as an old woman in London, reflecting yet once more on something that comes back to this issue of identity. The other day, so I'm reading in the voice of an old woman, London, about 1803 right now. The other day, they took me into a London school and had me talk to the children. One girl asked if it was true that I was a famous Mina D, the one mentioned in all the newspapers. Her parents, she said, did not believe that I could have lived in so many places. I acknowledged that I was Mina D, but that she could call me Aminata Diallo if she wanted, which was my childhood name. We worked on my first name for a while. After 3 tries, she got it. Aminata. 4 syllables. It's really not that hard. Aminata, I told her. She said she wished I could meet her parents and her grandparents. I replied that it amazed me that she still had grandparents in her life. Love them good, I told her, and love them big. Love them every day. She asked why I was so black. I asked why she was so white. She said she was born that way. Same here, I said. I can see that you must have been quite pretty, even though you are so very dark, she said. You would be prettier if London ever got any sun, I replied. She asked what I ate. My grandfather says he bets you eat raw elephant. I told her I'd never actually taken a bite out of an elephant, but there had been times in my life when I was hungry enough to try. I chased 300 or 400 of them in my life, but never managed to get one to stop rampaging long enough to stand still and let me take a good bite. She laughed and said she wanted to know what I really ate. I eat what you eat, I told her. Do you suppose I'm going to find an elephant walking about the streets of London? Sausages, eggs, mutton stew, bread, crocodiles, all those regular things. Crocodile, she said. I told her I was just checking to see if she was listening. She said she was an excellent listener and wanted me to please tell her a ghost story. Honey, I said, my life is a ghost story. Then tell it to me, she said. As I told her, I am Aminata Diallo, daughter of Mamadou Diallo and Sira Koulibaly, born in the village of Bayo, 3 moons by foot from the grain coast in West Africa. I'm a Bamana and a Fula. I am both, and will explain that later. I suspect I was born in 1745 or close to it. So that's Aminata in 1803 as an old woman just a step from the grave, meditating on her own identity. Again, I think her identity comes into question only in relation to her interaction with other people, in this case, a young white schoolgirl in London, England. So I really can't think of a social issue or a humanitarian crisis that has become more significant since the Holocaust than the current refugee crisis in the world. When you think that pretty well a third of Canada's entire population has become refugees from Syria alone, and that's not even to mention all the other countries in Central America, in South America, in Asia, and in Africa, all the other peoples who've become refugees from other countries. But Syria alone has produced about 12 million refugees in the last year, many living in Syria, many living in neighboring countries, many on foot through Europe trying to find safe haven, and some coming to Canada. You'd be amazed how difficult it is as a Syrian refugee to get into the United States right now. Just wait and see what happens if Trump gets elected. It would be funny if it weren't so serious, but unfortunately I think it's dead serious. And I think the measure of our humanity will be how we respond to this crisis. And even though I don't normally vote Liberal, last fall I said hallelujah, because I was so pleased to see our own regime change and so pleased to see that a government, regardless of the party, was willing to open up our gates and be more generous than the previous administration in terms of the welcoming of refugees into this land. And I think we have room. We have room in our country. We have room in our economy. We'll benefit in the long run from this pattern, and I'm glad that Canada has welcomed at least more than it was going to before, and we can continue to do more. My wife and I and some friends are involved in a tiny effort. It won't change the world, it'll just change our neighborhood, to bring a family of refugees into Hamilton. And I really can't see any other way to be right now but to engage in some small way. I can't change the world, but I can do a little bit, and that's, I guess, the most we can ask of ourselves. But in the illegal, I meditate on what it means not just to be a refugee, but to be a stateless refugee. And as Dr. Vanine mentioned in her introductory notes, When I was 16, I had my first summer job working in the Toronto airport for the Ontario Welcome House, welcoming landed immigrants, helping them find their luggage, helping them find accommodation, telling them how to apply for OHIP, how to look for work, sending them to cheap motels and hotels where they could spend their first weeks until they could find better places to live. That was what I did as a 16-year-old. It was an incredible introduction to geopolitics because the year when I was 16 was 1973. And of course, that was such a significant year in Canadian history because it was 1 year after 72, and we are still seeing the aftershocks of 1972. What happened in 1972? I'm sure many of you have this on the tip of your tongue. Pardon me? Well, I think that was 70 or something, but that's a really important point, but I was thinking of something a little different. In 1972, one of the world's most murderous despots deported from Uganda all Ugandan Asians. And if you were Asian and you happened to be living in Uganda in East Africa, you had to leave under threat of death. Thousands and thousands of Ugandan Asians had to flee or they would have been killed. And many came to Canada. We've had such a spotty history in terms of our response to refugee crises. I'm sure I don't have to tell you, but it's worth saying. In 1939, we declined to allow a ship of refugees from the Holocaust to come to Canada. Over 500 people were on that ship, and we sent them back. And over 200 of them died in concentration camps, and we refused to allow them entry. 1939. We have certainly had our moments of hideously inhuman behavior towards people in desperate situations. But a few times, we've done the right thing. When you think about the war in the former Yugoslavia, one of the most brutal civil wars that the 20th century saw, we welcomed all sorts of refugees from Kosovo and other places, and we opened our doors to them. When you think of the ending of the Vietnam War, we welcomed many Vietnamese refugees, many of whom have become among Canada's most prominent Canadians and the most engaged and giving Canadians. We also welcomed thousands of refugees from Uganda when Idi Amin expelled them. And they were coming to the airport in 73 still, because they didn't all come to Canada directly. Some came by circuitous routes. So although I was working with landed immigrants, I watched refugees waiting hour after hour in that airport, waiting to be processed, waiting to be allowed into this land. And for a 16-year-old from the suburbs of Toronto, it was a great introduction to world migration and politics and got me thinking. Other things have had me meditate more on this subject. And finally, it was time to write a book about it. And I wanted to write not just about a refugee, but about a stateless refugee, a refugee who's hiding in a nation that doesn't want him, a refugee hiding in a nation that's elected a government bent out of shape with xenophobic rage, so fed up it is with refugees in its midst, in a township living on the edges of its rich capital city, which is called Clarkson. This is the made-up land in the Indian Ocean, this rich nation. So fed up with refugees is this country that it's elected a government not unlike that of Le Front National in France in its policies, and not unlike that of Donald Trump if he succeeds in his presidential bid. A country that's bent out of shape with intolerance toward refugees and vows to catch and deport every refugee it can find and send them back. So I have created a protagonist who's an elite marathoner, 24-year-old man from another fictional island in the Indian Ocean called Zantorland. Keita Ali grows up in this country that's famous for two things. It's the third poorest country in the world. It's staggering under the weight of poverty. It's about to embark in a genocidal explosion within its ranks, not unlike that of the genocide we saw in Rwanda. But in the outset of the novel, as a young boy, Keita Ali dreams of fame and adulation and money in a country where he only has one shot at it. He happens to live in a country that produces the best madeleines in the world. It's surpassed the French in French baking. It was briefly colonized by the French but they've surpassed their masters, and they make great madeleines in Zantorland. This is a tiny speck of an island, a mountainous island in the South Indian Ocean, in between Madagascar to the west and Australia to the east. But the other thing that makes Zantorland famous in the world is that it happens to export the world's fastest marathoners. And in any given year, marathoners from Xantorland will sweep the top 5 places in the Boston Marathon and win gold, silver, and bronze in the Olympic Marathon. It's a country where children grow up running and walking at altitude. Marathoning is in the blood and the culture of the country. So it's completely dominant in the world marathoning community. So this is how Keita Ali hopes to make his mark. But in the opening pages of the novel, we find out that his country is erupting in genocide. He witnesses the worst things a child can witness, and he flees. He flees as millions are fleeing today. And he goes to the nearest country that he can get into, which is Freedom State, a massive industrial powerhouse, a parliamentary democracy, 3 hours to the north of Xantorland in the Indian Ocean, 3 hours by airplane, about a month by rickety fishing vessel, which is how thousands upon thousands of refugees have landed without legal right or documentation in Freedom State over the years, clustering in a township on the edge of the city, which is called Africtown, which resembles a little bit the story of Africville in Nova Scotia, but even more so resembles what I've seen in the townships of South Africa when I've been there on film business and as a writer. And so this is where Keita Ali comes to hide in Freedom State as a refugee in a country that's vowing to catch and deport all refugees it can find. And I'm just going to read you 1 or 2 brief excerpts and then chat a bit more and move over to questions. How are we doing for time, Dr. Vanin? We're fine. All right. Well, it's hard to write about a person who is fleeing genocide and who's in a state of shock. And I want to honor the kind of character I had in mind. And of course, normally a rule of thumb is if you're going to have a protagonist, he or she should be colorful and exciting and dramatic enough to hold the attention of the reader. But how do you write about somebody fleeing genocide and make them interesting? He's repressed in his emotions. He's hiding. He's a black man hiding in an otherwise white nation, and he wants to stay out of sight. He wants to stay hidden. He's revisiting the horrors of what he's just fled and the horrible things that have happened to his family. So he's hardly going to be a joyous, ebullient, colorful character. He has little to express emotionally because he's just choked up in grief. And anyway, we're following him in the first 3 months of his life in hiding in this new country. So how do you create a novel with a character who's decent, who's interesting, who's caring, but who's not lively or colorful? He's sort of half dead emotionally. And I wanted to honor that. I didn't want him to be super lively. So, but to keep the novel moving and interesting, I decided to kind of move into a structure in which there'd be 10 or so significant minor characters. And nobody in the novel gets to enter the pages of the book except for the piece they want of Keita Ali. Everybody wants something from him: to shoot him, to kill him, to extort money from him, to catch him and deport him, to seduce him, to write a newspaper story about him, to do a film documentary about him. Nobody gets to enter the pages of the book except for the piece they want of him. And everybody in this book is obsessed, for reasons good or bad, with Keita Ali. And so the novel it's a meditation on statelessness, but also a meditation on the impact that a newcomer can have on all these people living, in this country that he comes to. And so I also decided that each of these minor characters would have to be very colorful, and that their color and drama would bounce off his and thus drag him into a position that makes him interesting to reader, because he's responding to them and they're colorful. So that was my strategy, to try to keep the novel moving and alive, even though he's a quiet person as opposed to an outrageous or particularly colorful person. So one of the characters that he becomes involved with is an old woman. She's white, she's 85, she's got a slew of troubles, she's a widow. That's the least of her troubles. She's got a lot of problems. And it's the first time that I've written a character who vaguely resembles my own irascible mother. And so it had to pass muster with my mother before I got to my editor. But she actually enjoyed reading this fictionalized version of herself. Really, the things that happen to this woman aren't terribly much like the things that my mother's experiencing, but their personalities are quite similar. So here is Ivernia Beach, 85 in white, meeting for the first time the protagonist of the novel, Keita Ali. The year is 2018, and we're in the country of Freedom State. Ivernia drew a long breath, Some 20 years ago, and she was in her 60s and still had nimble fingers, she'd taken up the classical guitar. If you played an instrument, something new, something you'd never touched before, it was said to prevent your brain from rotting. The guitar instructor introduced her to the music of Fernando Sor and encouraged Ivernia to breathe while she played. She told him that she'd come to study music, not yoga. She had to abandon the instrument after it gave her tennis elbow. And now, as she ran once more through the events leading up to the accident, she replayed in her mind the single moment of kindness and light in an otherwise all-around shitty day. Ivernia had been driving south on Aberdeen Road. She'd already passed Main Street and Queen Street. Now she was entering the thick of the village, the attractive section of Clarkson lined with cafes, shops, beauty salons, bookstores. 5 blocks ahead were the Parliament building on the left and the Freedom building with offices for federal politicians on the right. Beyond them was a giant Ruddings Park, and beyond that, the railway tracks, the formal end of the city. And after 5 kilometers of no man's land, the sudden mushrooming of Africtown. But Ivernia wasn't going anywhere near that far. The Lox and Bagel was located right here in the heart of the village, and all Ivernia had to do was find a parking spot. She was driving her late husband's 1999 Oldsmobile Intrigue. It was 19 years old and not a speck of rust. Oversized like a car fueled with steroids, but it worked like a charm. Southbound traffic kept Ivernia to 20 kilometers an hour. It was a warm spring day. She had the windows down. Above the sound of traffic, she heard a man singing. Good voice. He had a lilting foreign accent. He was singing a country song. She glanced to her left. Nothing. To her right. There he was. A young black man was running as fast as her car. What a joy it must be, Ivernia thought, to move one's body with that ease and speed. Like Ivernia, he was heading south on Aberdeen. She wondered why he was in the road, but then noticed that pedestrians clogged the sidewalk. He was in his mid-20s, as thin as a pencil. Strapped to his waistband was an iPod, and from it white wires ran up to the buds in his ears. Clearly, he had no idea how loud he was singing the country hit that had become as familiar as a national anthem. I've been running for you, baby, running all the time, but you're running for another heart, and the heart you want ain't mine. Ivernia had turned off the radio 20 times in the last year just to avoid hearing another note of that song. But it sounded funny and somehow touching coming from this strange runner. Traffic slowed. He ran by her door. His head was bobbing to the music and his eyes were wide open. He caught her looking at him and smiled. She smiled too, and then pulled ahead of him as the lane before her opened up. It was odd that a man moving that fast could sing as he ran. She left them behind as she accelerated. Traffic moved quickly, and Ivernia caught 2 green lights. There up ahead, just 1 block, was the Lox and Bagel. Parking on Aberdeen was murder, but just ahead of her, directly in front of the Lox and Bagel, a car pulled out. Ivernia slowed down. A space big enough for her Oldsmobile. No fire hydrant. No reason she couldn't park there. She detested parallel parking, but there was no option. She pulled up beside a Jaguar, put the Olds in the reverse, and checked the rearview mirror. Lots of pedestrian traffic, but there was nothing between her and the BMW parked behind her. She backed halfway in, turning the wheel clockwise to ease into the spot, and then counterclockwise to straighten it out. She stopped midway to make sure she was fine. The Olds was such a big car. Everything looked okay, and then it happened. She was about to press down on the accelerator ever so gently to continue reversing when a baby cried, loudly. She meant to jam her foot on the brake, but instead mashed it down on the accelerator. The Olds shot back, and the next instant Ivernia felt metal crumple and heard glass shatter. A woman began screaming. Ivernia couldn't see the woman or the baby. Had she hit them? She flipped the gear into drive, pushed on the accelerator pedal again, and charged forward, catching and demolishing the back left end of the Jaguar. She put her car in park, turned off the ignition, and then opened the door to more screaming. Ivernia got out of the car. A woman stood on the sidewalk next to a stroller. The baby was in her arms. "Did I hit you?" Ivernia asked. "My car." "Are you hurt?" Ivernia said. "No, but almost. I was this close," the woman said, holding her thumb and index finger apart, "when you smashed into my car, and here I was with my baby." The singing runner showed up. "Hello, ma'am," he said to the young mother. "May I help?" She looked grateful. The runner lifted the stroller back to the far side of the sidewalk. The woman had dropped a bag of groceries. He retrieved cans and bags, bending and straightening until he stored them all in the stroller. The runner then saw Ivernia, looked straight at her. "Ma'am, are you all right?" "Yes, quite," she said, but she wasn't all right at all. He could see it in her eyes. "Why don't you sit down?" he said. There was a bench at the edge of the sidewalk, in front of the Lox and Bagel. He led her to it, his fingertips resting on her shoulder. She tried to remember the last time that anyone had touched any part of her body in a kind, solicitous way. "Everything's going to be okay. Nobody's hurt, right?" She nodded. He straightened, went to her car door, pulled out her purse and car keys, and returned with them. "Sit here. You'll need your things. Are you okay, ma'am? Breathe a little." Ivernia stared at him with glassy eyes. The earbuds were strung over his shoulder. From them she detected the tinny sound of country music. "I heard you singing back there," she said. He smiled. I sing when I train," he said. She heard a siren. She looked up and saw the police vehicle 2 blocks away. He said, "God bless, must run, take care." "Don't worry, everything will be okay." Once more he touched her shoulder. Ivernia felt the calm spread through her body. Nobody was hurt. What was the worst that could happen? "Wait," she said. "What's your name?" He hesitated, smiled once more, and said, "Roger Bannister." "Goodbye and good luck." He set off running again southbound on Aberdeen Road in the direction of Reddings Park in Africtown. Roger Bannister, she mumbled to herself. She knew that name. The British runner, the first one to break the 4-minute mile. He did it on May 6, 1954, 64 years ago. She remembered. She was 21 years old, and it was a day that she and Ernie married. She wished that she'd had time to tell that to the runner. A hand was on her shoulder, a firm hand. Ma'am, were you involved in that accident?" She looked into the eyes of a square-jawed police officer whose expression seemed to say, "You've gone and ruined my perfectly good day." Perhaps Ivernia should have waited for a lawyer, or fought the charge, or sought the plea bargain. She knew all about those things, but she was an old woman, and she had no mind for subtlety. So she just looked at him and said, "It all comes down to one thing, officer. I screwed up, so can we get on with it?" It was a day later now, and her license was suspended, her car impounded, and she was feeling suffocated in the meeting room of the Office for Independent Living. She was bursting with impatience. She wanted out. Whatever they were going to do to her, she wanted it over. So here she was telling her 3 inquisitors one more time that she realized the gravity of the situation but did not want a lawyer. "Could we just get this done?" she asked, keeping her hands under the table so her 3 inquisitors could not see them shaking. When you reached the age of 85, hands were simply not to be trusted. Ivernia tried to calm herself by thinking of the gentle face of the runner, the one who stopped to help everybody, herself included. The runner was the only person who said a kind word to her that entire day. Ivernia hoped the runner was not a refugee, or if he was, that he would not be caught and deported. She focused on her breathing and on good thoughts. Fernando Sor, the runner, singing country music, marrying her husband on the same day that Roger Bannister ran the Miracle Mile in 3 minutes and 59 seconds. Ernie had been good to her from their first day together to their last. Breathe, Ivernia, breathe. Keep breathing and just answer their stupid questions. Thank you.
So, Lawrence Hill has agreed to take some questions. So we have a microphone and one on each side. Feel free to come forward. I'm going to ask you to be as concise as possible so we can get as many people in as possible. And I'll let you. We've got 10, 20 minutes.
10, 20? Okay, good. Thank you. Sure. If you have any comments or questions, I'll do my best to take them. It can't be any tougher than what the student asked me this morning. How old do you expect to be when you write your last book? Well, I'll have to import some of those Oakville students. Oh, here comes a question. Great.
My name's Nadine Heemstra.
Hi.
Thank you very much for your talk tonight. I always really enjoy listening to you speak. My question is around the topic of identity, but maybe expanding it a little bit beyond the individual. Mm-hmm. I think since the election, Canada's identity is changing, perhaps, after 10 years underneath Stephen Harper, who I think I saw trying to create a different kind of an identity for Canada, and now with a very different leader. I'm wondering what your reflections might be on how a country's identity can be shaped or changed, or how easily malleable that might be.
Thank you. That's such an interesting question, how a country's identity can be shaped and how malleable that identity is. And I don't know that I have a great succinct answer, but I'll offer up one interesting point. There's so many ways to step at that, but I'll step into it personally. I have 5 kids, and my eldest is Genevieve. She's 25. Actually, I named the protagonist in the Book of Negroes after her because Genevieve's middle name is Aminata. So the protagonist in the Book of Negroes is named after my eldest daughter, who was 11 when I started working on the book. Now 25. She lives in Geneva. She's doing her MA, and she's studying international development. So once she finished her BA at McGill, we were talking about where she'd study, where she'd do her master's in international development. And I was sort of hoping that she'd study in Canada because we'd see her more, it's cheaper, she'd get a better scholarship, and all sorts of parental conservative reasons why I was sort of hoping she'd stay in Canada. But she's going to go where she's going to go, and of course I'd support her in that decision. But privately I was hoping for Canada. So I just said, what about, a grad school in Canada? Would you consider it in international development? And she said, absolutely not. And I said, why not? And she said, Canada's reputation in the world of international development has been so besmirched in the last 10 years of the Harper government that nobody's going to respect a graduate coming out of Canadian universities. I think she was extreme in saying that. Nobody in the international development world would respect a Canadian degree. And she said that if she wanted to land a good job, she should get a degree out of Europe, which is kind of interesting because the far-right policies in many European countries are much more conservative than those in Canada. But at any rate, she chose to study in Europe because she felt that Canada's identity, Canada's worldwide perception as a country that had gone sour on issues of international development, that this would limit her job opportunities if she studied at a Canadian university. So it was a very strategic and interesting decision she made. And I don't know just how true that was. She knows a lot more about this than I do, but she has landed a really good job after finishing, or just about finishing her MA in Switzerland. And so it certainly didn't hurt her. But I think it's true, kind of like relationships. It's easy to tear down a country and to damage a reputation. It's very hard to build it back up again. It's easy to damage a personal relationship, and it's very hard to restore trust or to rebuild that relationship that's been hurt. And so I suppose, I expect that it's going to take a long time, for Canada to regain respect in the world that some Canadians at least feel that it's lost. But I can't really position myself as an expert on what constitutes a national identity, except that when leaders publicly express hate, I think it gives license to others to express the same thing. And I'm now referring to Trump and his cronies. And the reason I don't think it's a laughing matter, the reason I take Trump extremely seriously is that regardless of, and some people say, well, it doesn't matter. He's not going to beat Clinton in the presidential race. So he's just going to win the Republican nomination and then it'll be over. And maybe that'll be true. I hope that he doesn't get elected president, and he probably won't if he runs against, say, Hillary Clinton. But that's not the main thing for me. It's not so what, he's not going to become president. Here's a man who's in the front pages of newspapers every day around the world and every day in North America, saying the most hateful and despicable things, and saying things like, we're going to build a fence between us and Mexico, and we're not going to let in Muslims into America anymore, and really, approaching the sort of awful denunciations that we heard arising out of Nazi Germany. And for me, it's very frightful that a man that powerful, who gains that much attention, would have that much influence on and prey on the fears, the worst instincts that we have. And the reason I wrote the illegal, and set it in the future, in a kind of a dystopia, in a country bent out of shape with hatred, was I wanted to warn my readers about what we could be looking at if we embraced that kind of vision, if we let our worst sides trump our better sides, and so we all, I guess, have that ability to go to that awful place, but I'm hoping that we transcend it. And so I suppose national identities are slow beasts, and they're particularly hard to improve. They might be easy to degrade, but they're hard to improve, and I suppose it takes time, kind of like turning around a huge ship in the sea. Hello.
Hello, my name is Pat. Thank you for the wonderful talk today. I found it really enjoyable and insightful. And I was wondering if you had any particular challenges with exploring the identities of your various characters, especially if you might not have experienced the same things as they did.
Did I have any troubles expressing or developing the identities of my characters, especially if I didn't experience the very things that they did? And that's a really good question. And it kind of reminds me of a question I was asked by the students this morning. And one of them said, well, what are sort of the key ingredients in becoming a writer? And then I asked them, well, what they thought the key ingredients would be in becoming a successful writer. I wanted to hear what they said before I answered it myself. And to my great pleasure, instead of trotting out kind of cliches, they said, well, it must take passion and imagination and courage. These are three things that three different students offered up. Instead of you have to know how to spell well or something, they went straight to much more noble and profound observations: courage, imagination, vision, passion. And it's so true what they said. And it does take courage to write about people that you can't be. And I think we do children and young writers a grave disservice when we tell them that they must write about the things they know. Well, what do you know anyway? Do you know it because you experienced it at 10 years of age in Don Mills, Ontario? Or do you know it because you researched it? Do you know it because you lived it? Or do you know it because your neighbor lived it and you've had 5,000 conversations with your neighbor? Do you know it because somebody in your family experienced it? Or do you know it because you have an amazing imagination, you've done a lot of research, and you feel you have a story welling up inside you? And even if you do choose to write somewhat autobiographically, well, not every character can be that, or you'd lose your readers awfully fast if every character were the same reflection of you. And so even in the same book, if your protagonist resembles you a little bit, what about all the other characters? They've got to be very different. It's sort of taken as a given that characters have to speak and act and behave in different ways to make them distinct. So you still face the challenge of articulating rich characters, even if one of them resembles you. And what about all the other books you're going to write? We've just talked about the first one. So you really do face the obligation of standing in other people's shoes and trying to imagine their experiences and expressing your humanity by empathizing with other people. It's a huge challenge. But paradoxically, I'm not the best judge of my own writing. I'm not the person who's in a position to say, I'm good at this and I'm bad at that. It's better for other people to decide what I might be good or not very good at as a writer. But when I judge myself, as weak as my own judgments of myself would be, I'm most pleased with my own characters when they're completely different people from the person I am. And the closer a character comes to looking somewhat like me, the more boring they are on the page and the more uninteresting they are. And I found that the characters I've made who couldn't possibly be me are generally the most vibrant, dynamic, interesting characters. And partly it's because I can let go. When I'm inventing a character who bears no resemblance to me, I can just let it rip. I can go into the deepest well of my imagination fearlessly because I don't feel I'm revealing myself. I'm just revealing my soul, which finds itself into another character. And so it's dangerous work. It's very easy to offend people. You can make huge mistakes very quickly, but it's what writers do. The job of a writer is to empathize with a variety of characters and have them interacting and bring them to life on the page. So our very stock and trade is to imagine people that are usually not us. Dangerous work.
Thank you very much for coming. My name's Nick.
Hi.
I'd be interested in your comments on identity and spirituality. As far as colors of skin, it's interesting. Both my sons thought I was black at some point in their lives. And it's not because of my skin color, it's because I was born in Africa. So I'm always interested, but beyond the skin color, if you could share some thoughts on identity and spirituality, if you would.
Well, that's a really interesting question, identity and spirituality. You asked just the right person, because I was raised by two atheists, who I was joking with Dr. Vanin about this earlier. My grandfather on my father's side and my great-grandfather were university-trained theologians who were ordained ministers in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. But having a grandfather and a father who were ordained ministers turned my own father into an atheist. The war sort of contributed to that as well, the Second World War. And so he came out the other end as an atheist, as my mother did. And so I was raised by two people who just didn't introduce religion into our household at all. I began to discover it as a teenager, reading. Reading is what began to introduce me to religion. And I had to reach beyond my parents to begin to connect with that. So whatever I might have to say is not so much grounded in personal experience, but just in my own intellectual and creative growth as a writer. Well, spirituality and identity, of course, I could take that question literally and refer to the Spanish Inquisition, which is probably the first time in the history of the world that we have people who are defined spiritually and racially and then set up for oppression and for murder and the stripping of their citizenship on the basis of their religion and their identity. And we have this term that develops in Spain, in medieval Spain at the time, set up by the Catholic monarchs, and the term is limpieza de sangre, which means purity of blood. And this is the first time that I've been aware, maybe some historian in the room knows an earlier example, but I haven't found one, that we find the term blood purity appearing in written Western literatures. And blood purity, of course, means that if you're Jewish or if you're Islamic and you're living in medieval Spain at a time that there are many people of Jewish and Islamic background living in Andalusia, in other parts of Spain, then you're going to be, burned at the stake or dispossessed of your property, murdered, or certainly at least kicked out. And we have the Spanish Inquisition. And so since then, we seem to have found convenient ways to castigate and demonize people on the basis of their blood purity or their supposed lack of blood purity. And when it comes to demonizing a people, whether it's for spiritual reasons or for racial reasons, the easiest path, it seems, that perpetrators of genocide take to justify their heinous acts is to attack the purity of blood of the victim. You find it in the Holocaust, you find it in Rwanda, you find it over and over again. You find it, of course, in the transatlantic slave trade. To deny a person's humanity, you go there by denying the purity of their blood, by suggesting that they're somehow less human than you because their blood is tainted. Their blood isn't the same as ours. And so it can be used to justify an attack on a person's spirituality or on a person's racial background. And of course, both were happening in the time of the Spanish Inquisition. It's possible to change your identity in terms of spirituality too. Think of all the people who moved from one religious faith to another for all sorts of reasons. Maybe they converted because they wanted to marry somebody and they felt that they had to convert in order to marry somebody. Or maybe they're trying to flee the Holocaust. And so perhaps they were in a position to save their lives by passing as Christian when they're actually raised Jewish. There are all sorts of people who, for various reasons, to save their lives or to better their lives or to enter romantic relationships have found the need to alter their spirituality. Even in medieval Spain, in the time of the Spanish Inquisition, those who had converted to Christianity from Islam or from Judaism were still not considered, even though they were leading citizens and had been for generations in Spain, they're not considered to be truly Spanish, to be truly of pure blood. And so it didn't work for them to have converted generations ago. They still, in the end, were demonized. And so I guess if you want to demonize a person, whether it's based on their spirituality or their supposed race or anything else, you'll find a way to do it. And I suppose our job is to stand up to those who taint our spirituality or our background and accuse us of being somehow subhuman. But watch the language. Whenever you want to demonize a person, you go after their humanity. What was the cultural practices term that was used in the previous government? Barbaric, yes. Barbaric cultural practices. This was a term employed to justify certain interventions. And I found that so offensive because, again, to liken a person as being barbaric is moving in that same direction of trying to deny their humanity. But I'm sorry I couldn't do better, but you can blame that on my parents. Perhaps one more question? Or are we? Oh, two? Sure, go ahead. Both, we'll do the three of you for sure.
My name's Garrison. I'm a social development studies student here at UWaterloo. I'm a person of multiracial background, and I guess my question is, or what I would like to hear from you, your ideas, is how can you, as a person of multiracial background, who is confused as in where their family's from, what cultural practices we have to understand and what we want to adhere to, when our society likes to put us into holes, we're pegs that get put into holes. So how do people of multiracial background kind of understand and find out where they belong within those peg holes there?
How do people of multiracial backgrounds sort of defy expectations about how they should be defined and just find out for themselves how they belong and where they belong? Well, of course, many of us are multiracial backgrounds and might not even know it, or might not even acknowledge it, and might not be acknowledged in our own family genealogies. Tiger Woods, who has a background that includes both white and Asian and black, playfully refers to himself as Cablinasian, Caucasian, Black Asian, Cablinasian. He calls himself that to be funny sometimes, or at least he used to. And he can get away with that, I suppose, because he was Tiger Woods. But how do you? And often I'm asked that question by students, too, who can feel really tortured at 14 or 15, 16, where do you belong? And I find that age of puberty, not only is it a time when you're sort of figuring out your sexual identity and your sexual orientation and your relationships to your peers and your class and your looks, and so many aspects of your identity are coming into focus with a lot of disturbance. But it's also a time where, in my experience, people begin to really meditate openly on their racial identity if they have multiple strands of identity. And I suppose I would say that it takes some courage and it takes some insistence and some willpower, and it's not always going to be easy, but I think you have the right to decide for yourself how you're going to see yourself. And when I was interviewing people for Blackberry Sweet Juice, I interviewed 34 other Canadians who, like me, had one black and one white parent. It was the first time that I went around the country from Vancouver to Halifax, talking to people and asking all sorts of intimate, impertinent questions like, what are your dating preferences? And how do you do your hair? And how did you think of yourself racially when you were 14 as compared to how you saw yourself when you were 21? But one really interesting thing that I began to observe when I'd interview siblings in the same family is that they'd have often radically different attitudes about how they saw themselves. And why shouldn't they? Why shouldn't two siblings in the same family, growing up in the same household, with the same demographic makeup in their communities, why shouldn't they have different ways of seeing themselves? They might have different political ideologies. They might have different professions eventually. Why shouldn't they also have different ways of seeing themselves? Is that such a bad thing? That's what pluralism is really all about. So I think easy for me to say this, hard for you to walk it, but I think you and everybody else should, especially in 2016, should feel the right to begin to insist, to assert and affirm your identity as you like it. And that identity might change. And probably the way you see yourself at 20 won't be the same way you see yourself at 40, and it won't be the same way you see yourself at 60. I just accompanied my mother on a visit to her doctor in the hospital yesterday, and she was insisting on certain things regarding her identity, and she's 88 years old in a couple of days, and she wanted a change in the way that she was being perceived, by the medical system, her identity as a medical patient. And she wanted to insist on a different way of being seen. And why not? Why shouldn't she? And so I think identity is fluid. It's up for grabs. It's often hard to assert because people often resist the things that you say, but you've got to do it. And you have the right to. You have the right. And by the way, I don't see any reason why you can't, if you wish to, embrace every single part of who you are and what your background is. You don't have to be just one thing. Your identity might comprise 1,000 things, from your career to your sexuality to what you like to read to your state in relationships to race and religion, and even those things can have subcategories in them, and even those things can change you. You may change your mind, and that's, as far as I'm concerned, totally legitimate. So I don't see any reason why you can't and shouldn't embrace as much of yourself as makes you feel good, and to refuse to allow other people to tell you that you have to be this and not that because that pleases them. You need to stand up for yourself, and that's not always easy, and you will encounter resistance. People who want to pigeonhole you in a certain way, but I guess that's where it comes time to push back. Thank you for your question. Two more, yes. How about these two questioners here? Yes.
Thank you for sharing all your insight this evening. I'm Jane Cowan. I'm a high school English teacher in town, so that idea of identity is very central to a lot of the literature I cover with my students. I found it fascinating that in the novel that you created these fictional lands of freedom state and Zentoro land. Given as you say, the geopolitical situation in the world right now, you could have chosen any number of countries in which the same kind of paranoia and oppression would take place. Were you hoping to elevate this to some sort of a mythical land or an allegorical concept by doing that? Yes,
I was looking to create an allegory. And why would I invent two countries when, as you say, we have all sorts of, anti-refugee policies at play in the world today? Well, one thing is, I didn't want to write the Book of Negroes all over again, and I didn't want to feel beholden to reflect the specific geopolitical reality of Canada in 2016. I wanted to be free to create a country, a dystopia, a country gone amok with hatred that reflected my worries and my ideas about where we might go in the future. And I didn't want to worry about reflecting Canada as it is today, or Texas, or France. I just wanted to create a world that seemed right to me. And sometimes, this is the first time I've ever written a novel and made up places. Every other one of my 9 books is very specific. But sometimes you can get a reader to drop their defenses, drop the yardstick that says, is this me? Is this my country? Is this real? And sometimes literature that goes into made up places can be incredibly moving and seductive and really get a reader to think more deeply and drop their defenses a bit. The Little Prince, The Handmaid's Tale, 1984, The Wizard of Oz, Alice in Wonderland. I mean, over and over again, we've been seduced by phenomenal literature that has partly excited us because it's brought us into imaginary places that seemed real but weren't quite. And Harry Potter, I say dead seriously, I read every one of those books because my kids devoured them. So I think J.K. Rowling has a phenomenal imagination, just a brilliant imagination. And I wanted to read what my kids were reading, so I read them all with my kids. And Harry Potter, as far as I'm concerned, is a meditation on the Holocaust. The fundamental issue in Harry Potter is whether the forces of evil will succeed in exterminating mixed race or mud-blooded wizards. Those of impure blood, racially impure wizards, are up for genocidal extermination. And the fundamental struggle in that whole series is whether the forces of genocidal perpetration will vanquish the forces of goodness. in the novel. So kids who are reading Harry Potter are reading a 2,000-page meditation on the Holocaust, as far as I'm concerned. A really interesting thing to draw children into it. And I don't think they would have read it if it reflected, say, literally Nazi Germany or something like that. They read it in such great numbers because it was set in this imaginary place. It was more seductive to them, but could still disturb them in their complacency and shake them up a little bit. So sometimes literature set in imaginary places is more powerful. And anyway, I want to shake free of the obligation to reflect my world specifically as it is today, but to sort of warn the reader about where we might be going tomorrow.
Hi, it was a pleasure listening to you speak. I'm a student here studying psychology. My name's Marisa. Right now, my area of interest is about gender and gender identity formation, that kind of stuff. So listening to
Sorry, gender and what?
Gender and gender identity formation.
Got it.
So listening to you talk about racial identity has a lot to do with the same themes that are involved in gender identity.
Yes.
And what I thought was really interesting was when you talked about how society changes the way that you see your own racial identity when you were in Vancouver to when you went to Quebec. And I thought that's very similar to what happens with gender identity. Society dictates how somebody portrays their own gender identity. So my question is, how would you advise people to arm themselves against how society tells them to be when they have this strong sense of gender identity that they wish to express?
Sure, and thank you for the question. And I'm the last person to proclaim any expertise in this, but you hear so often people talking about their own gender transformation as finally sort of making it home, finally kind of making it into the person that they feel they were born to be. Kathleen Winter meditates on this on her novel, I'm drawing a blank for a second. Thank you, Annabelle. Thank you, Bruce. Yeah, on her novel, Annabelle, she meditates on this very profoundly. And, it takes a lot of courage to go against the grain, to go against expectations, whether it's 2016 or 100 years ago. It takes a lot of courage, and it sometimes can get you killed, to be somebody that the world isn't ready for you to be yet. And I can't think of a kind of a transformation that's more radical, that would involve more upheaval, shake up people more, and elicit more possibly negative responses than changing your gender. That I can only imagine how hard that must be to pull off. And I can also only imagine how much easier that will be if you're in a community of supportive and loving people. And at least if your key people, understand you and you don't have to explain yourself to them every day. If at least you feel some nest of safety and comfort in a world that still isn't necessarily ready to accept the idea that you may feel compelled to change your gender because it's just not working for you the way you were seen and you believe you're somebody else. So all I can say is to hang on to your courage and to build a good, solid network of as much as possible of people who love you and respect you for who you are and for who you're trying to become. And that's got to make something of a difference. But I have nothing but respect for people who choose to change the way they are and who choose to assert another way of being. It's got to be very difficult sometimes, and so I'd say all the power to them. Thank you very much.
So get ready to clap again, because I'm going to invite forward Dr. Veronica Austin of our Department of English to formally thank our speaker on our behalf.
On behalf of St. Jerome's University, we'd like to thank you for your wonderful talk today and for being so generous in answering questions. We were very excited to have you here to talk about these ideas of identity and to address just how much context affects identity. And that reminding us also that identity is in part constructed by others, those around us, but also reminding us that that may affect how we perceive ourselves, but that hopefully it doesn't determine how we see ourselves. I especially appreciated that you were able to address these ideas through sharing some of your literature with us. In doing so, you were able to show that literature is one of those key ways that we can contemplate some of the serious issues of our times. You also show us that through the imagination, through reading, through writing, we expand our imaginations. And hopefully through expanding our imaginations, we can also expand our capacity for empathy, and in that way, also our sense of humanity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Veronica. Just a couple of announcements before we finish up the evening. First of all, I want to remind you to sign up in our foyer if you want to receive the latest information about the anniversary lectures, as well as any other lectures and events that are taking place at St. Jerome's University. We do send out regular email reminders, so if you would like to hear about what's going on here, please feel free to sign up before you head out tonight. Every year, St. Jerome's University is pleased to present a program of speakers to our community, and that we can present them to you free of charge. And we're able to do this because of the generosity of so many partners and supporters. If you too would like to support the lectures, there are some donation envelopes available on some of the chairs here in Siegfried, and then also in the foyer. And as always, I want to express our deep gratitude to all who have given so generously to support our lectures. If you missed it on the way in, please, on the way out, there are a number of wonderful, fairly traded products available for sale in the foyer by our Social Justice Committee. So there's a nice table to visit if you're looking for maybe some Easter treats. Our local independent bookseller, Wordsworth Books, is with us this evening. As you saw on the way in, Lawrence Hill's books are available for sale, and Lawrence has agreed to sign some books. So as soon as we finish up, we'll walk him right to the table, and he will meet you and sign your books. The next Bridges lecture that connects arts and mathematics is going to take place next Friday, March the 11th. Artist and programmer Nathan Selikov, along with composer and music theorist Dmitry Timokshov, will explore some of the many connections between mathematics, music, and visual art. The springboard for this lecture is going to be their collaborative work in progress with the Kitchener-Waterloo Symphony, and that is going to be premiered in April 2016. So the Bridges lecture is next Friday. The next and last anniversary lecture is going to take place on Friday, April the 8th. John Boros from the Faculty of Law at the University of Victoria, Leah Gazan from the Faculty of Education at the University of Winnipeg, and Niga Nwedem James Sinclair from the Department of Native Studies at the University of Manitoba are going to be here for a panel discussion on the topic, First Nations in Canada, Seeking True Reconciliation. They're going to discuss the issues that Canada must face honestly and critically as First Nations move forward from this process of truth and reconciliation. How do we create an economic future for First Nations and revitalize their cultural practices and languages? What are the legal issues that need to be addressed? How do we engage the violence that floods Indigenous communities? We hope you will join us as these speakers help us to face what inhibits fruitful dialogue and also to learn about what will lead to relationships of justice. So, finally, I want to thank all of you for coming this evening. We look forward to seeing you next Friday, perhaps for Bridges, and for the next anniversary lecture on April the 8th. But for now, have a safe trip home, and until next time, good night.